Hello, I'm David Healy, and I've been asked by Derek Blumke to give this talk to you today. It's good to be here. The usual history of medicine is that it began in Europe, and doctors from the United States went over to learn how to do the job over there. This history is wrong. Modern medicine began in Boston in the 1840s with the discovery of anesthesia. This posed all sorts of problems. We were going to poison you with a drug that could kill you, but would also put you to sleep so we could mutilate you and maybe save your lives. There was a lot of complex ethical issues here, and a lot of people to this day are still not clear about the right thing to do. During the 1840s, a phrase appeared which is politics is nothing more than medicine on a grand scale. In this case, this talk is really more caught in the phrase war is surgery on a grand scale because anesthesia on its own wouldn't have created modern medicine. It took the American Civil War to do that. Prior to the Civil War, both the North and the South had disbanded the medical corps they had because doctors, what use were they on the battlefield? In the case of the North in particular, they put a bunch of young men who had no background in medicine on the job to train on the job to deal with the injuries that were new that were being caused by rifles and snipers with fractured arms and legs caused from bullets and open chests and open abdomens and things like that. And these guys learned on the job, and anesthesia made that possible, along with analgesia from morphine and a new gadget, the syringe. They also appreciated the need that the Europeans didn't at this stage for hygiene. If you really want to get a good outcome, you had to keep the whole place clean. And operations were happening. The early medical intervention happened on the battlefield. There was triage happening to pick out the people who were most likely to respond versus the ones who seemed to be beyond help. And both sides introduced the Red Cross and paid heed to it. The North, in particular, created hospitals. Now, you'll tell me there've been hospitals for hundreds of years. There weren't. There were places where people used to go to die, which you could call a hospice, really, but not places where you went to get treatment that might save your life. These only emerged around the time of the Civil War. What you're seeing here in this picture, which won't look like a hospital, is Quincy on the Mississippi. And this is a building that's been converted over into a hospital. And this was the second hospital in Quincy. And by the end of at the Civil War, Quincy had five hospitals, which was more than almost any other major urban area in the entire world. There were also floating hospitals off at the Carolinas coast. Now, when the war ended, these hospitals were all closed down, but the United States began to build hospitals in every major urban area, along with moving universities in, and that's created the kind of cities that we have now. By 1900, the United States had more hospitals than all the rest of the world combined, and was doing more operations than all the rest of the world combined. These hospitals did surgery, not medicine, because up till 1900, there was very little medicine could do for anyone. One of the other things the United States did was to pioneer the idea of an urban grid. You might have Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic hospitals, but if you got hit by something, the ambulance would turn up and bring you to the closest hospital. And there was a duty on people, if need be, to provide you with free care for the injuries you had. Now, the Germans recognized what was happening in the United States and copied it, and that led them to beat the French in a war a few years later. And the Japanese copied the Germans, and that led them to beat the Russians in a war in 1904, when the Japanese became the first army to lose more people to enemy injuries rather than to disease. The country that lost the least soldiers to disease won wars. So there was an arms race involved, but an arms race about healthcare inputs. And this continued through World War I and World War II. In World War I, we had the development of prosthetics, of rehabilitation medicine, transfusion for operations on the battlefield. vaccines given to troops beforehand, the management of things like dysentery, which have been killing loads of people. Now, you see a picture here of a woman. One of the other things that happened, which the war brought about, was a huge change in gender stereotypes. The men were having nervous breakdowns on the battlefield. The women were running the hospitals behind the lines and doing the surgery. In World War II, we got antibiotics, and shortly afterwards, most of the major drug groups that we now have. We had the US military using computers in a way no other military was, and this led on to the military development of the internet, which is one of the biggest influences on health today. It led on to the fact that most of your operations are being done by robots, or an increasing number of them. And it's led on the combination of robots and the internet to telesurgery, that is, surgery from thousands of miles away, which will be needed when we go into space. So, really, when you look at it, the military have had much more input to medicine as we know it than anyone else. If you look at the history books, though, what people have thought drives history forward. They've talked about the gods, the one true God, or whatever. Then they've talked about the individual genius of scientists and people like that. That's not what drives things forward. For the last 100 years or more, it's been very much a case of military input, the development of techniques and technologies. And the word innovation now has become a buzzword. If it's new and innovative, we assume it has to be good, which isn't always the case, because the military were also to the fore to developing propaganda techniques, to using Hollywood as a place to bring to the fore the kinds of things that people needed to be concentrating on in a time of war. Now, the other word for propaganda is marketing, and we're going to return to this. But the point I'm trying to make is if you've got new and better propaganda techniques, it's not always going to be the case that you're going to get better outcomes from the medical or any other inventions you might make. So, 1982, here's an innovative technique, the first selective serotonin reuptake inhibiting drug, the first SSRI. Prozac was the fifth. 20 years before this, experts had agreed that serotonin reuptake inhibiting drugs could cause you to commit suicide and cause you to commit homicide and had other problems. We also knew there was nothing wrong with the serotonin system in the nervous systems of anyone who had any nervous problem. The person who created the first SSRI and got a Nobel Prize was Arvid Carlsson, whom you see here, and his view was, like LSD, SSRIs were working on a normal serotonin system, which meant that they could produce some good effects for some people and some bad effects for other people. The good effect was they were anxiolytic, they were serenic, they chilled you out a bit. The bad effect, as Carlson was happy to admit, was that people could become suicidal on them. His main gadget in producing the SSRIs was you, listening to what you told them about the effect of these drugs. Now, 25 years ago in this unit here, I, with colleagues, ran an experiment to test some of his ideas. Do SSRIs produce a serenic or emotional numbing effect? Could doctors and nurses who were drug-free and illness-free randomized blindly to an SSRI or non-SSRI, could they tell the difference between these drugs? And was the SSRI something that produced a serenic effect? And the answer is, Carlson was right. SSRIs do produce a serenic effect, but 1 in 10 of our volunteers became either suicidal or homicidal. The other interesting thing about this experiment was the patients in the ward had no idea that anyone was on any of these pills, but they were able to come up to me within 48 hours and ask me if that doctor was on a pill and if it was an SSRI. And the answer is he was, and it was. How did they know? Well, they observe us much more closely than we observe them. They could spot the change in the body language and the facial expressions and the emotional numbing, the reactivity. And they knew exactly what was going on in a way that we don't when we give these drugs to them. So that's going to be true of you listening in to me as well. You know more about these drugs if you trust yourself than your doctors or nursing staff do. So back around 1992, when Zoloft launches in the UK, I'm quite close to the pharmaceutical companies, so much so that I'm chairing the launch meeting for Zoloft in the UK. And I give a talk saying, serotonin is more primitive than estrogen, and if we now have drugs that act on it, we're going to see and hear things that we've never seen or heard before, provided we're looking and listening. Trouble is, this was not the message Pfizer wanted you to hear. They wanted you to think we know everything about Zoloft. There's no need for a doctor to look at this, and his job is to prescribe, and the job for the patient is to take. And that's all caught beautifully in this cartoon here from 30 years ago, where what's happening is the companies have new serenic drugs, which are weak antidepressants. But they want to call them antidepressants rather than anxiolytics because there's a benzodiazepine dependence crisis, and they figure it's going to be easier to market these drugs as antidepressants. So they have to convert people who are on Xanax and Ativan into people who are going to be taking Prozac and Zoloft. And from a marketing point of view, this is easy peasy. These days, the propaganda has become so good. And depression is going to be reimagined as a serotonin deficiency, which vitamin serotonin is going to put right. No chance of any adverse effects on vitamin serotonin. The key slide is down there on the bottom right, which is from a pharmaceutical industry point of view, the consumer of these drugs is your doctor, not you. And industry figure he doesn't, their mission is to make sure that he won't have a thought in his head, not put there by them. They don't want you putting thoughts in his head. They want to make sure he has no adverse effects at all, which was going to be a problem because 10 years before these drugs came in the market, industry had done healthy volunteer trials also and given these drugs to people like Tracy Johnson, who had gone on to commit suicide, and she wasn't the only one. So industry knew there was a shed load of problems coming your doctor's way, and their job was to make sure he just didn't see them. How do they do it? Well, this brings me back to marketing. And what you need to appreciate is really industry only got into marketing by the 1980s. Up till then, the pharmaceutical industry was pretty small. All our drugs are really post-World War II. So you don't have this huge, big industry uh, for long. They become a big industry around 1980. And the kinds of things that happen are here. In a Pfizer trial during the 1990s, a man becomes very agitated on the Pfizer drug he's on and pours gasoline on himself and sets fire to it, intending to kill himself. He doesn't die there and then. He dies from his burns in hospital 5 days later. Now, legally, when this happens, the company have to write a narrative which lets FDA and everybody know exactly what happened. And when you read the narrative, you realize he should not have been coded as death by burns. He should have been coded as death by suicide. The coding, this is the first act of authorship, and it's the first act in the creation of misinformation. Now, this 15-year-old boy was, it's not actually this boy, but a 15-year-old boy was in a trial of Paxil for teenagers who are depressed. And after he's been on the drug for 2 weeks, he ends up out in the street with a gun in his hand, waving it around, threatening to kill people. The police are called. He gets brought to hospital. There should be a narrative report to let me and you know and FDA know what's going on. There isn't. This guy vanishes, and four other children taking Paxil in this trial also vanish. And to this day, FDA have no idea what happened because companies have found loopholes, not just in their SSRI trials, but in all trials for hiding events like this that they don't want anyone to know about. And here's some more events they've hidden. These red dots are the suicidal events in the clinical trials of Prozac, Paxil, and Zoloft that brought these drugs on the market. And you'll see there's much more red dots on the new SSRI drugs than on the placebo. But you'll also see under the word screening there's a bunch of red dots. And what's happened here is we've had to take people off the antidepressant they were on and put them in withdrawal. And this is a terribly dangerous phase when people go on to try and kill themselves. But the companies look at this and say, hey, These people go on to kill themselves and they're on nothing, which is the same as placebo, isn't it? So we can move those red dots over under the placebo heading when we show the data to FDA. This is a breach of regulations. You might even say it's fraud, but you can't because, as the company said, FDA saw exactly what we did and they didn't have a problem with it. Here, a few years later, is Pfizer keen to get Zoloft on the market for PTSD, and they've run 4 trials on it. In the case of all 4 trials for men, the results are negative. In the case of 2 of the trials, there's a minimal effect for women. And based on this, they're able to persuade FDA to license Zoloft for PTSD. And you'll also see here that they've written the articles already, and one of them is going to go to the pharmaceutical industry's favorite journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, and the other is going to go to JAMA. So these are going to the very best journals, but over on the left, you see author TBD, to be determined. Pfizer's marketing department are going to decide what the names are that are going to be on this article that will be most likely to persuade other doctors to use their drug for this purpose. The authors won't have seen the data, won't have written the article. The ghostwriters have written the article, and this is true for all drugs, not just SSRIs. But they won't have seen the data, and FDA won't have seen the data. When it comes to drugs, and this is all drugs you might be put on, the greatest concentration of fake literature on earth centers on the drugs your doctor gives you. The best propaganda on earth is the medical literature about these drugs because the propagandas become invisible. It's masquerading as science. Now, I told you there was a study 329, which is a trial of Paxil given to teenagers who were depressed, where this young man ends up on the street waving his gun around. GSK published that as this a wonderfully successful trial. Paxil worked well and was free of problems in 2001. In 2002, they applied to FDA to get this drug licensed for teenagers who are depressed and tell FDA we did 3 trials in depressed teenagers, all negative. And FDA say, well, we agree with you. These were all negative trials, but we agree also that we're going to let you claim your drug works for teenagers who are depressed. And we're also agreeing with you that we shouldn't mention this in the label of the drug. Why not? Well, a year beforehand, GSK have published in a good journal the fact that this drug works wonderfully well in this trial. If the label of the drug says, no, it didn't, GSK might get charged with fraud. And we wouldn't really want GSK or any pharmaceutical companies to be charged with fraud, would we? They did later get charged with fraud. Um, how often does this happen? Well, it's actually pretty common. Here you see the published articles on the antidepressants we know and love given to adults. And look at the column 3 from the right, the one that's got 2 white boxes in it, 61 and 62. They're the Zoloft data. And this is the drug that most experts these days tell you is the best of the SSRIs. It's the one you should use, free of problems, etc., etc. But FDA are not looking at just the published literature. FDA get to see the reports the companies send into them on what these trials showed, and the data looks more like this. And in particular, look at the column 3 from the right, the Zoloft column, which now only has 1 white box in it. To license Zoloft for depression, FDA should have at least 2 positive trials. They don't. When you add all of the adult and pediatric trials together, more than half of these trials are negative. But 1/3 of the previously positive trials that you saw were, in fact, studies with negative outcomes published as positive. So what you're seeing for study 329, the fraud, we could call it, is very, very common. What are FDA doing in all this, you might ask? Well, the clue is in the name, Food and Drugs Agency. When the UK joined the European Union 50 years ago, they ran into problems which led them to come out of the European Union a few years ago. It was to do with chocolate. They were told by the Europeans, you can't call your favorite chocolate chocolate because it hasn't got enough cocoa solids in it. This is what FDA do. If you have enough cocoa solids in the chocolate, you can call it chocolate. If you have enough animal fats in the butter, you can call it butter. If you've got a change in a rating scale in your antidepressant trials, you can use the word antidepressant. FDA don't say this is good chocolate. They don't say butter is good for you. And they don't say that antidepressants will save lives. There's almost no set of trials done on any drugs submitted to FDA that show any of these drugs save lives. All you see is something like a rating scale change with more people going on to suicide and ending up dead on the drug than on the placebo. So FDA aren't super scientists looking after you and me and ensuring that we remain safe. FDA are a bunch of bureaucrats whose main job is to keep the paper trail clean. And as the old phrase goes, you can take a bureaucrat to paper, but you can't make him think. And you shouldn't expect FDA to ever do any thinking. So, what companies are doing with all these trials is trying to create the impression in your doctor's mind that you've got a magic bullet here that is only going to go to the spot of the nerve ending where there's a problem and it's going to fix it and put it right without affecting the rest of the body at all or without having any impact or interaction with any other pill you might be on. This is a magic bullet or cruise missile image. But when Arthur Carlson created the first SSRI, he didn't think it was a magic bullet. He thought it was what he called a therapeutic principle. Therapeutic principles are like laxatives. There's four different kinds of constipation we can have, and four different kinds of laxatives. And your grandmother used to be great at picking out the right kind of laxative for the constipation you had. But once a company now gets a license to claim their drug's a laxative, they're interested to make sure that everyone who's got constipation ends up on their laxative. They don't mind if you end up on other laxatives also, but you should mind because this is a recipe for treatment-resistant constipation. And the same applies to antidepressants, but treatment-resistant depression these days is a recipe for people getting treated with euthanasia. So Arvid Carlson figured SSRIs are a serenic drug which will suit some people. Less than half the people who go on an SSRI are going to be suited to it. And just to bring the point home, it's a good or can be useful or helpful for people with OCD. But he's faced with a bunch of people with OCD who said, yep, your SSRI helps me, and other people who said, no, it doesn't, and I become suicidal. But smoking, nicotine, helped me. So he ran a trial of nicotine for OCD and said, yes, actually, there's a bunch of people whom SSRIs won't suit that nicotine does much better. And if that's true for OCD, it's going to be true for all anxiety states as well. Is nicotine more dangerous than SSRIs? Well, if you put nicotine or alcohol into the 6-week trials we use for antidepressants, nicotine and alcohol would look a lot safer than SSRIs or almost any other drug you could be put on. Where's your doctor in all this? What you hope is she's like the pilot there in the middle, keeping an eye out for things going wrong and letting the powers that be know if she spots anything going wrong. And she's got an incentive to do this because she knows that if she takes you up on a flight from Detroit to maybe Seattle, if you die, she's going to die too. So she's got an incentive. The lady on the right's a banker. And you know that during the financial crisis, bankers like this sold us mortgages knowing that they could explode and destroy our lives. But provided they kept quiet about that, they continued to earn their bonuses. They're in a state of what we call moral hazard. Your doctor on the left is more like a banker than a pilot. She knows or should know that the pills she's putting in your mouth can explode and destroy your life. Provided she doesn't tell you this and gives you the pills, and in particular, provided when things go wrong that she doesn't take your side and agree that the pill has caused the problem, she's going to collect her salary and your life's going to be destroyed. She has no incentives to take your side, to be courageous. The man on the left is one of the clearest cut cases of SSRI-induced homicide I ever had. He had a 50, I mean, he was 50 years married to the same lady whom you see on his left. He gets put on an SSRI for a minor problem. He's a bit worried about his income tax. He has a bad reaction to it, and we know this because he used to keep a diary before all this, and you can see when he goes on the pills, he pretty instantly starts figuring, I've got some strange thoughts, and then thinking, I must be going crazy, and they're going to lock me up. And his wife brings people in to look at him, people who know him, and they see a man who's more agitated than anyone they've ever seen before in their life, pacing up and down, tearing his hair. He has what we call akathisia. No one expects, however, that on the seventh day, he's going to wake up and get a mallet and batter his wife to a pulp. He gets brought into hospital. The pills he's on get stopped, and he returns to normal pretty quickly. I write a report saying, look, this man is not guilty and should be let walk free. But his lawyers have a better idea, which is to put in a plea deal. So he says, I'm guilty, and the judge gives him a year sentence. When he comes out, the place where he lived, no one thought that he was a murderer, but he comes out a convicted murderer, and no one will speak to him. He has to leave the town where he's lived all his life and move to a different country. The gun on the right is James Holmes, the Batman killer from Aurora, who's a shy and inhibited university student who gets put on Zoloft by his doctor and changes from being disinhibited and flirting with girls and buying motorbikes and buying guns and going to a gun range, uh, and saying to his doctor, well, he keeps a diary where he describes all this, the manic delirium, as he calls it, and he says to his doctor, if you knew the thoughts that were in my head, you'd lock me up. And she says, well, you're responsible for the thoughts that are in your head. So the thoughts are he's going to shoot dead 12 people and seriously injure 72 others. Now, when I get to see him, it's very clear from a lot of other details that there's a great case for saying the Zoloft caused all this. But the defense lawyers don't use my report. They come to a deal with at the prosecution, I suspect, which is that one juror will say, well, yes, he's guilty, like all the others said, but don't execute him. And for defense lawyers, that's a victory. If you end up locked up for 3,000 years but not executed, from their point of view, that's a win. Probably not from, well, not from James Holmes' point of view, and probably not yours either. Now, part of the reason why a deal may have been on the table is my report would have brought in things like this, which is 10 years before the drug came on the market, 30 years before the Aurora shootings. Pfizer had done a healthy volunteer trial in women, giving them 150 milligrams, and reporting that within 4 days, all of them had dropped out because they were getting agitated and aggressive and suicidal. Exactly the akathisia that you've been hearing about uh, today. And Pfizer interviewed them all and drew their own conclusions, which was, yes, our drug definitely caused this. And it's well known that drugs acting on the serotonin system can cause this also. This is a bit more severe than what we're used to, maybe because these volunteers were susceptible. This is a little snippet from an SSRI trial, one of the trials bringing one of these drugs on the market. And what you've got is the doctors are rating the patient and saying he's improving. This is going to be a trial which shows our SSRI works, and it's going to help us get the drug approved by FDA. But in fact, when one of the doctors talks to the man, they realize that things look very different to what the rating scale seems to show, which is he's there thinking about killing others and killing himself. How often does this happen in the trials that brought these drugs on the market? Well, up to 1 in 20 people have a neuropsychiatric effect like this. In the Zoloft healthy volunteer trial that I ran, 1 in 10 people had neuropsychiatric reactions like this. In Pfizer's healthy volunteer trial, 100% of the volunteers had neuropsychiatric reactions like this. So the lady on the left there is Marilyn Lamack. And she's regarded as superwoman by almost everyone who knows her. She's the chief nurse in a busy hospital ward in a Chicago hospital. She keeps her family together. She's got an overbusy husband who's hardly there. She's got three kids to look after, and she does a ton of community work for all sorts of people. She's no mental problems or nervous history at all, except after Emily's birth there. She put on a bit of weight and wants to lose weight, and her doctor gives her Prozac because it has a reputation for weight loss. It doesn't suit her at all. She later gets a stimulant, and that helps her lose weight, and she feels very happy. So, in 1998, she goes to her doctor, Dr. Hubbard, and says, "Look, I'm worried my husband is thinking about divorcing me." And they agree that Zoloft is not the answer to this. She comes back after a few weeks and she's a little bit more worried. And he says, "Well, Zoloft can't do any harm." And he puts her on Zoloft and brings her back every few weeks to chat to her. And he puts the dose up every single time. And every single time she gets more and more anxious. Um, and finally, her husband is sleeping openly with another woman. And she's on a 200 milligram dose. And the doctor asks her, "How are you doing on this dose?" And she says, "Well, I don't care as much about the divorce now as I did," which is exactly the problem these drugs can cause in terms of causing too much emotional numbing. So a few days later, she calls the emergency department and says, "Look, I've tried to kill myself and I have killed my children. You better get over here." They come over. She lands up in hospital, gets tanked full of drugs. She ends up in a jail cell, tanked full of drugs. She ends up coming into trial, not able to testify for herself. She's so tanked full of drugs. Illinois at the time doesn't have a law which says you can bring the drug into the case as part of your defense. So she doesn't get a fair trial. The prosecution have an easy job. They just ask all her friends, "Did you see any sign of mental illness?" And none of them did. The only person who says anything different was her father, who said, "For the last few months, this was not the Marilyn that we knew." Her doctor, Dr. Hubbard, comes in and says, "Well, she seemed to be responding. She wasn't as worried about the uh, divorce now when she was on 200 milligrams of Zoloft." So she was sent to jail and is there 25 years later. She comes off the drugs soon after she actually goes to jail and is just fine. Took her about 10 years to start thinking maybe the Zoloft played a part, and there is an appeal for clemency in there for her. I don't think she got a fair trial. I don't think you could get a fair trial. Maybe your children, because increasingly it's going to be your kids who are on these drugs who are going to do something awful. Because, to get a fair trial, you've got to persuade a bunch of jurors that FDA would let a drug that can cause homicide on the market. They aren't going to believe it. You've got to persuade them that the New England Journal of Medicine is full of junk data. They're not going to believe it. You got to persuade them that Dr. Hubbard, this nice doctor who has been looking after you or your children, whom you trust, who comes into court and says, "Well, I think it was, the person's fault that all this happened," will have been told by his lawyer that you cannot blame the drug. If you do and the person gets off, you might be charged with involuntary homicide. And no doctor told this is going to figure that it will be a good idea to blame the drug. So, where does this leave you? Well, one of the things about you who are listening to me is when you got recruited to the military, you're among the fittest mentally and physically people in the United States, or you wouldn't have been recruited. You had to be the best. And even if you've got a prosthesis now, you still should be the best, but aren't. And the question is, why not? What's gone wrong and what can you do about it? And what's gone wrong is the propaganda. Industry came up with a great idea back in the early 80s. Look, the reason healthcare costs are so out of control is because we're waiting too long to treat people. We wait till they have a disease. We should be treating them much earlier to prevent them getting a disease. Treated with bisphosphonates to thicken bones, statins to lower cholesterol, Singulair for allergies, anti-diabetics for glucose, antihypertensives for blood pressure, and the antidepressants and all the other drugs for nervous problems. But all of these drugs cause more admissions to hospital than they prevent. They cause more serious problems and deaths than they prevent. This is a recipe for disaster. As you might expect, asking people to take nicotine and alcohol every day for the rest of their life is going to lead to illnesses. And remember, in clinical trials, nicotine and alcohol cause less problems than all of these drugs you see here. So you're being tanked full of these drugs, partly because we want to give our vets the best deal, but these drugs are causing you the problems that you now have. I'm Irish, and we've always been very pro the United States. We figure it's the best place around the place. And in particular, someone like me went into medicine during the 1970s because US life expectancy was the best. And what you were doing with physical illnesses and mental illnesses was better than anywhere else. And the top of the curve there, the red sort of top of the red curve shows you that the US around 1980 had the best life expectancy in the world. That's when you began giving tons of drugs to healthy people who had nothing wrong with them. And you can see what's happened to life expectancy since then. It began to fall. It began to fall, first of all, below other wealthy countries. And now, and this is all before COVID, it's got even worse with COVID. But, before COVID, you had fallen below Cuba and a bunch of other countries. Something's gone badly wrong. And it's not just life expectancy. The social fabric of our Western countries is rocking at the moment, partly because up till 10, 15 years ago, the most solid thing we knew was that most people who claim disability are between the age of 35 and 55, and they claim disability payments because they've got muscular problems or skeletal problems from hard laboring jobs. Now, most people who claim disability are between the age of 18 and 35, and they're claiming it because they've got ADHD or autistic spectrum disorder or depression or bipolar disorder. They're being disabled because they're being told you have an illness when they don't. They're being disabled because they're given drugs for this illness. Back in World War II, you guys were a band of brothers who were different to each other. Some of you were introverted, some extroverted, some with this skill, some with that skill. And that's what made a good team that worked. But that's now being ironed out, and they're all been made disabled the same. Stepford soldiers, as it were. And this is bankruptcy. This, you don't have people who ought to be in work, paying taxes, keeping things going, aren't. They're collecting pensions from the age of 18, and it cannot keep going. So there's two things. One is what can you do for yourself? And the other is what can you do for all of us? The first point about what you can do for yourself is you got to appreciate that when you're on the ton of drugs you're on now, you're in a situation like the one you see here, which is a lot of these things can explode when you try to move them. It needs a lot of skill. It needs a lot of scientific input to get things right. And where does the science come from? It comes from you, not your doctor. You can get a doctor to help you by looking at you and listening to you and working with you. But a doctor who tells you what the guidelines say you should do is trying to convert you to a different religion and is likely to kill you. You need to appreciate that your hunches, your observations that stem from the privileged position you're in, which is you're on these drugs and know what they're actually doing to you and where you want to get, are the key things. And people should be working with you, not trying to get you to fit in with their views. And the other thing is this. UK vets introduced me to the idea of sanctuary trauma. And it's a great idea, which is you go along to doctors for help and you end up being made worse. how do you put this right? And how do you put it right for everyone in the United States and elsewhere? And the answer is, to borrow a phrase from the NRA, drugs don't kill and injure vets, prescribers do. What can we do about this? One of the things maybe is you could go along to the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, Eric Rubin, who gets paid $750,000 for leaving his backbone at the door when he goes into work. And you can say to him, look, what he's doing with the material that he publishes in his journal is injuring and disabling vets. And can he stop doing it? You'd be very nice to him, of course. Or you can go along to Governor Pritzker, who's sitting on a clemency petition for Marilyn Lamack, and explain to him, look, it's not just Marilyn, it's vets and others who are not going to be able to get a fair trial. And what can he do about it? And doesn't he realize there could be a lot of votes in this if he just does the right thing? Or you can aim high and say, should we get rid of prescription-only medicines completely? Well, prescription-only medicines were introduced to control addicts in 1914. And they treat all of us, not just you, they treat all of us if we go along to a doctor like addicts. You feel it when you go along. Also, in the case of the SSRI drugs, which can cause you to commit suicide and homicide, well, you can get a bunch of these over the counter in the form of antihistamines. All of the SSRIs are antihistamines. Some of the antihistamines over the counter are SSRIs and can cause problems, but don't. Because if you take a pill over the counter and you have a bad reaction to it, you know you're going to stop it. You're not inhibited by a doctor who says to you, oh no, you need to keep taking these for weeks before they work, and who might decide to double your dose. You do need a good doctor, but you don't need them to be controlling your access to these pills. You need someone whom you can go along to, maybe me, and you say, look, uh, I'm thinking about taking these drugs, or I've tried this drug over the counter, had a bad reaction to it. If I'm not controlling your access to these drugs, I'm much more likely to give you real value to say, yep, you know what? I wouldn't take that either. Yes, I've seen loads of people react the way you're reacting. You're going to get a more valid, trustable response from me in that kind of position. And you're going to make my job a lot more fun if we're both researching these issues together rather than me trying to persuade you to do things that, don't really make sense. So, thanks for listening to me, and I hope that vets in general can mobilize because the country feels it owes you something. And also, it's maybe a little bit scared of you if you mobilize. You are in a better position to make a real difference here. And the difference, whatever of the options you pick, it's all about making America honest again so that the rest of the world can look up to it. Thank you.